Chapter 5. Niels and Dennis rose to their feet instantly, but O'Malley held up a hand to stop them taking any further action.
"That's all right now, boys. Easy does it."
They didn't resume their seats, but moved to stand behind him, forming a solid wall of muscle and flesh between him and the fireplace. O'Malley, recovering from his initial surprise, studied the man sitting opposite him. He was small, and there was more grey than black in his hair. Altogether, not someone who would normally cause the smuggler too much concern. But O'Malley had spent years assessing potential enemies, and he knew to look beyond the physical side of things. This man had hard eyes, and an air of confidence about him. He'd just walked into a lion's den, found the head lion, and tweaked his tail. And now he sat opposite, cool as a cucumber, unworried, unflustered. He was either a fool or a very dangerous man, and he didn't look foolish. O'Malley glanced quickly up at the man's companion. Tall, broad-shouldered and athletic-looking, he thought. But the face was young, almost boyish, and he lacked the smaller man's air of calm certainty. His eyes were moving constantly between O'Malley and his two cohorts, judging, measuring. He dismissed the young man. Nothing to fear there. It was a mistake many had made before him, to their eventual regret. Now he looked back to the doorway and saw the youth who had approached him the previous night. He was standing away from the door a little, his longbow in his hand, an arrow nocked on the string. But the bow was lowered, at the moment threatening nobody. That could change in a second, O'Malley thought. Dennis and Niels had appraised him of the youth's skill with the bow. Niels' ear was still heavily bandaged where the boy's arrow had all but severed it from his head. He searched for the name the newcomer had given, then remembered it. Halt character had a similar bow. And now O'Malley realized that he was wearing a similar cloak, mottled and hooded. Same weapons, same cloaks. There was something official about them, and O'Malley decided he didn't like that. He had no truck with anyone official. "King's man, are you?" he said to Halt. Halt shrugged. "Not your king." He saw the smuggler's lip curl contemptuously at the words, and suppressed a small flame of anger at his late brother for letting the royal office become so downgraded. No sign of the emotion showed in his face or eyes. "I'm Araluen," he continued. O'Malley raised his eyebrows. "And I suppose we should all be mightily impressed by that?" he asked sarcastically. Halt didn't answer for a few seconds. He held the other man's gaze with his own, measuring him, judging him. "If you choose to be," he said, "it's immaterial to me. I mention it only to assure you that I have no interest in your smuggling activities." That shot went home. O'Malley was not a man to discuss his work openly. A scowl formed on the Hibernian's face. "Watch your words. We don't take kindly to people who walk in here accusing us of smuggling and the like." Halt shrugged, unimpressed. "I didn't say anything about the like," he rejoined. "I simply said I'm not worried by the fact that you're a smuggler. I just want some information, that's all. Tell me what I want to know, and I'll bother you no further." O'Malley had leaned forward over the table to issue the warning to Halt. Now he sat back angrily. "If I wouldn't tell the boy," he said, jerking his thumb towards the silent figure by the doorway, "what makes you think I'll tell his grandfather?" Halt raised an eyebrow at that. "Oh, that's a little harsh. Uncle might be closer to the truth, I think." But now the smuggler had decided enough was enough. "Get out!" O'Malley ordered flatly. "I'm done with you." Halt shook his head and those dark eyes bored into O'Malley's. "Maybe," he said, "but I'm not done with you." There was a threat and a challenge implicit in the words, and they were delivered in a tone of thinly veiled contempt. It was all too much for O'Malley. "Niels, Dennis, throw this fool out into the street," he said, "and if his little friend by the door raises that bow an inch, cut his throat before you do it." His two henchmen started round the table towards Halt, Niels going to his right, Dennis to his left. Halt waited until they were almost upon him, then said one word, "Horace?" He was interested to see how the young warrior approached the problem. Horace began with a straight right to Dennis's jaw. It was a solid blow, but not a knockout punch by any means. It was simply intended to give Horace a little room and time. Dennis staggered back, and before Niels could react, Horace had pivoted and hit him with a crushing left hook to the jaw. Niels' eyes glazed and his knees went slack. He dropped like a sack of potatoes and hit the floor, out cold. But now Dennis was coming back, swinging a wild roundhouse right hand at Horace. The young man ducked under it, hammered two short lefts into the smuggler's ribs, then came up with a searing uppercut to the point of Dennis's jaw. The uppercut had all the power of Horace's legs, upper body, shoulder, and arm beneath it. It slammed into Dennis's jaw and sent an instant message flashing to his brain. The light went out behind Dennis's eyes like a candle in a hurricane. His feet actually lifted several centimeters off the floor under the force of that terrible blow. Then he too simply folded in place and crashed to the rough, sawdust-strewn boards. The entire sequence took a little less than 4 seconds. O'Malley goggled in amazement as his two bodyguards were dispatched with such contemptuous ease, and by a young man he had dismissed as no threat. He began to rise, but an iron grip seized his collar, dragging him back down and across the table. At the same time, he felt something sharp, very sharp, against his throat. "I said, I'm not done with you yet, so sit down." Halt's voice was low and very compelling. Even more compelling was the razor-sharp sax knife that was now pressing a little too firmly against the smuggler's throat. O'Malley hadn't seen him unsheath the weapon. It occurred to him that this greybeard must be capable of moving with alarming speed, just as his young companion had done. O'Malley looked at those eyes, seeing in the foreground a blurred picture of the murderous steel that rested against his throat. "Now, I'll let the grandfather remark pass," Halt said, "and I won't even take offence at the fact that you just tried to have your bully boys assault me. But I will ask you one question, and I will ask it once. If you don't answer me, I'll kill you. Right here, right now. Will," he called in an abrupt aside, "if that big fellow by the sideboard takes another step towards me, put an arrow into him." "Already saw him, Halt," Will replied. He raised the bow in the general direction Halt had mentioned. The heavily built seaman who had thought he was unobserved suddenly held up both hands. Like most of the others in the room, he had heard of the 2 arrows that shot between Niels and Dennis the previous evening. Initially, he'd thought it might be worth his while to lend a hand to O'Malley, but it definitely wasn't worth getting himself shot. Will gestured with the arrow, and the man sank down onto a long bench. The gleaming arrowhead was enough to worry him, but of even greater concern was the fact that the bearded man hadn't seemed to glance in his direction once. "Now," said Halt, "where were we again?" O'Malley opened his mouth to reply, then shut it again. This was new territory. He was used to setting the agenda, used to having others defer to him. He didn't deceive himself that he was liked by the other men who frequented the Heron. But he knew he was feared, and that was even better. Or so he had thought. Now that the people in the crowded tavern could see someone who instilled more fear in them than he did, he was left totally powerless. Had he been liked, maybe someone would have interceded on his behalf. But without Niels and Dennis, he knew he was on his own. Halt studied him for a moment, understanding the thought process that was going on behind the other man's eyes. He saw the flicker of doubt and uncertainty and knew he had a winning position. Everything that Will had told him about his earlier confrontation with the smuggler had led him to believe that O'Malley was not a well-liked figure. Halt had been depending on that, and now he saw that it was true. Some days ago, you transported a man called Tennyson and a group of his followers somewhere out of the country. Do you remember that? O'Malley gave no sign that he did. His eyes were locked on Halt's. Halt could see the barely suppressed fury there. Fury fanned by O'Malley's helplessness in the current situation. I hope you do, Halt continued, because your life may well depend on it. Now, remember what I said. I'm going to ask this question once and once only. If you want to continue living, you will tell me what I want to know. Clear? Still, there was no response from the smuggler. Halt took a deep breath, then continued. Where did you take Tennyson? There was an almost palpable silence as everyone in the room seemed to lean forward expectantly, waiting to see what O'Malley was going to say. The smuggler swallowed several times, the action causing the tip of the sax knife to dig painfully into the soft flesh of his throat. Then, his mouth dry and his voice almost a croak, he replied, You can't kill me. Halt's left eyebrow shot up at that. A strange half-smile twisted his mouth. Really, he said, and why might that be? Because if you kill me, you'll never find out what you want to know, O'Malley told him. Halt gave vent to a brief snort of laughter. You can't be serious. O'Malley's forehead creased in a frown. He'd played his only card, and the stranger was treating it with contempt. He was bluffing, O'Malley decided, and his confidence, at its lowest ebb, started to grow once more. Don't try to bluff, he said. You want to know where this Tennyson fellow went, and you want to know badly, else you'd never have come back here tonight. So, take that knife from my throat, and I'll consider telling you, although it'll cost you. He added the last 4 words as an afterthought. He had the whip hand, he thought, and he might as well use it. Halt said nothing for a second or two. Then he leaned across the table. The knife point stayed where it was against O'Malley's throat. I want you to do something for me, O'Malley. Look into my eyes and tell me if you can see any sign there that I'm incapable of killing you. O'Malley did as he was told. He had to admit the eyes were a chilling sight to behold. There was no sign of pity or weakness there. This man would be capable of killing him in an instant, he knew. Except for the fact that Halt needed him alive, and that made his victory even sweeter. This grey-bearded wretch would kill him in an instant. He probably wanted to kill him right now, but he couldn't. O'Malley couldn't help a smile forming on his face as he thought about it. Sure, I'm convinced you would, he said almost breezily. But you can't, can you? It'd never do to gamble with this one, he thought. His eyes showed no sign of the frustration and uncertainty he must be feeling now that O'Malley had called his bluff. Let's just review this, shall we? Halt said softly. You say I can't kill you, because then I'll never find out what you know. But at the same time, you've told Will over there that you won't divulge that information."
"Ah, well now, that may be open to negotiation," O'Malley began, but Halt cut him off.
"So, if I kill you, I'm not losing anything, am I? But it will be some compensation for the trouble you've caused. On the whole, I think I rather want to kill you. You're an annoying person, O'Malley. In fact, now I think about it, I'm glad you don't want to tell me, because then I would feel duty-bound to spare your miserable life."
"Now, look here."
The returning confidence O'Malley had felt had gone again. He'd pushed this man too far, he realized. But now the tip of the heavy knife left his throat and pointed at the tip of his nose.
"No, you listen to me," Halt said.
He spoke quietly, but his voice cut like a whip.
"Look around this room and tell me if there's anyone here who owes you any sense of loyalty or friendship.
Is there anyone here who might protest for 1 second if I simply cut your throat?" In spite of himself, O'Malley's eyes wandered quickly to the watchful faces. He saw no sign of help there. "Now, answer me this. Once you're dead, are you sure there's not somebody in this room who might know where you took Tennyson, and who might be willing to share that knowledge?" And that was the point where O'Malley knew he'd lost. There certainly were people in the room who knew where he had taken the white-robed man. At the time, it had been no big secret, and if he, O'Malley, wasn't around to ensure their silence, they'd fall over themselves telling this grim-faced tormentor what he wanted to know. "Crayskill River," he said, almost in a whisper. The knife wavered. "What?" Halt asked him. O'Malley's shoulders slumped, and he lowered his gaze.
"Crayskill River. It's in Picta, below the Mull of Linkeith. It's one of our rendezvous points where we deliver cargo."
Halt frowned, disbelieving him for a moment. Why the devil would Tennyson want to go to Picta?
O'Malley shrugged. "He didn't want to go there. He wanted to get away from here. That's where I was going, so that's where I took him."
Halt was nodding slowly to himself.
"I could take you there,"
O'Malley suggested hopefully.
Halt laughed contemptuously. "Ha ha! I'm sure you could. My friend, I trust you about as far as Horace could kick you, and I'm tempted to find out how far that is. Now, get out of my sight."
He released his grip on the other man's collar and shoved him back.
Off balance, O'Malley tried to regain his feet, then Halt stopped him. "No, one more thing. Empty your purse on the table." "My purse?"
Halt said nothing, but his eyebrows came together in a dark line. O'Malley noticed that the sax knife was still in his right hand. He hurried to unfasten his purse and spill its contents onto the tabletop. Halt poked through the coins with a forefinger and selected a gold piece. He held it up.
"This yours, Will?"
"Looks like it, Halt," Will called cheerfully. After having been humiliated by O'Malley, he'd enjoyed this evening's confrontation. "Take better care of it next time," Halt told him. Then he turned back to O'Malley, his face set, his eyes dark and threatening. "As for you, get the hell out of here." O'Malley, finally released, rose to his feet. He looked around the room, saw nothing but contempt in the faces watching him. Then he did as he was told.